Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of information, distill it, and really try to equip you with the essential knowledge to be truly well-informed. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of how our brains actually make decisions.
Right, and often in ways that traditional economics might call, well, misbehaving.
Exactly. Misbehaving. We've pulled together some truly intriguing sources for you.
Yeah, and they reveal quite a bit about how our perceptions, our emotions.
Even seemingly irrelevant details, right?
Totally. Things you wouldn't think matter, but they drastically influence our choices.
We're talking about everything from, like, how happy we are with an exam score,
Hmm.
all the way to how we save for retirement, even how governments can, nudge us.
It's really remarkable how this whole field, behavioral economics, it kind of started just by observing how real people,
Actual people, humans.
yeah, humans,
Yeah.
how they differ from the perfectly rational econs you see in classical economic theory.
The ones that always make the right choice on paper.
Precisely. So our mission today is really to unpack these surprising insights and figure out why they actually matter to you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with a story right from the classroom. Imagine you're taking an exam,
Okay.
but the total points available aren't the usual 100. They're, say, 137.
Okay. Odd number.
Right. Now, maybe the exam's a bit harder,
Yeah.
and you only get 70% of the answers right.
So not a stellar percentage.
Not percentage-wise, no.
Yeah.
But your numerical score is a cheerful 96 points.
Oh, 96. That feels good.
It feels great, right? You'd probably be delighted with that 96.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what happened in one professor's class. The students were just ecstatic seeing scores in the 90s.
Even over 100 sometimes.
Some even hit over 100. Now, their actual grade, their final grade, wasn't affected at all.
But their happiness.
Their happiness just soared. And the professor, he chose 137 quite deliberately.
Why 137?
Well, partly because it pushed the class averages into the 90s, which felt good for everyone. But crucially, it made it really hard for students to quickly convert their score into a percentage in their heads.
Ah, so they just saw the big number, 96, 102.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
saw the high number and felt good. And even though there was a clear explanation of the system in the syllabus, complaints about how difficult the exams were, they just vanished completely.
Wow. That exam story is, it's a perfect illustration of what economists might playfully call misbehaving.
It really is. But, it's not just about grades, is it?
No, absolutely not. It's about understanding real-world choices, often with much bigger consequences.
Right. Like, think about how we assess risk, for instance. Some of the early research in this area actually looked at occupational mortality rates.
It's like how dangerous a job is.
Exactly. Trying to figure out, essentially, how much people would need to be paid to accept a higher risk of dying on the job.
That sounds grim. How did they even get that data?
Well, interestingly, the data came about partly thanks to a conversation with the researcher's father, who was an actuary.
Huh. Shows where good data can come from.
It really does. But it points to this fundamental question of, perceived value and risk.
Okay, this leads us neatly into something called the endowment effect. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Mhm.
So imagine two graduate students. Both are pretty broke,
Been there.
right? They both unexpectedly get free tickets to a really big, sought-after basketball game.
Nice.
Okay, so the first student, let's say a divinity student, goes to the game, has a great time, thinks, wow, free tickets, awesome.
Makes sense.
The second student, an MBA student, immediately turns around and sells his tickets for hundreds of dollars each.
Ah, okay. Different approach.
Very different. And what's striking is that each student thinks the other one is completely nuts.
That's a classic illustration, really. The MBA student, they instinctively saw the cost of going to the game.
Not just the price paid, which was zero.
Right. Not the zero price, but the $1,000 or whatever it was he could have made by selling the tickets.
That's the opportunity cost.
Exactly. The economic concept of opportunity cost what you give up by choosing one thing over another.
And the divinity student.
Well, focused entirely on the tickets being free, just ignored that implicit cost, didn't even enter the calculation.
And this ties into a really pivotal idea from Kahneman and Tversky, doesn't it, about heuristics.
Yes, exactly. The idea that people often rely on these mental shortcuts or simple rules of thumb heuristics,
Right.
which are often useful, but they can also lead to predictable errors in judgment, biases.
Got an example?
Sure. A good one is the availability heuristic. If I asked you, say, if Druve is a common name.
Druve. Probably not where I live. I'd say no.
Right. If you're not from India, you'd likely say no, but globally, it's incredibly common. So we tend to judge frequency based on how easily examples come to mind, how available they are in our memory.
Which can lead us astray if our personal experience isn't representative.
Precisely. When local experience doesn't reflect the global reality or even just a broader reality.
Okay, building on this, let's talk about how we perceive value itself. Daniel Bernoulli, way back in 1738.
Yeah, a long time ago.
He introduced this idea of risk aversion. He said that happiness, or what economists call utility, it increases with wealth, sure, but at a decreasing rate.
Right, and this is what's known as diminishing sensitivity. It's a key concept.
Okay.
Meaning an extra $100,000 is absolutely life-changing for, say, a peasant, but for Bill Gates.
A rounding error. He wouldn't even notice.
Exactly. It would go almost unnoticed. Now, Kahneman and Tversky took this a step further. They focused not just on the absolute levels of wealth.
But on the changes.
Yes, on the changes in wealth. Because, fundamentally, humans experience life as a series of changes, not static states.
Like walking into a room.
Perfect example. You don't really register the absolute temperature unless it's extreme. What you notice is if it changes from what you've already adapted to.
The contrast.
It's that sensitivity to change, not the absolute level, that really drives our perception and feeling. It's key.
Okay, but for a long time, traditional economists, they weren't really buying all this, were they? They kind of dismissed these behavioral observations.
That's true. There's definitely resistance. They often used what was called the as-if argument.
The as-if argument.
Yeah, they'd say something like, well, okay, maybe firms don't explicitly sit down and calculate marginal costs and revenues.
Like in the textbooks.
Right. But they behave as if they do, so the theory still holds.
So it doesn't matter if the internal process is different as long as the outcome looks the same.
That was the argument. Fritz McClelp famously used this analogy of a driver passing a truck on a two-lane road.
Okay.
He said, the driver doesn't pull out a calculator and do physics equations. They just sort of know it's safe to pass.
They have a feel for it.
Right. And he argued business executives operate similarly with their decisions. So the resistance to these behavioral findings was really strong. People argued, well, if the stakes were higher.
The incentive argument.
Exactly. If the stakes were higher, or if people had more chances to learn these so-called misbehaviors, these anomalies, they'd just disappear.
Okay, so let's tackle those criticisms. The first one, incentives. If the stakes are high enough, people will get it right.
Right.
But does economic theory only apply when the stakes are massive?
Well, no, not at all. I mean, a good, robust economic theory should work just as well for explaining how you decide which popcorn size to buy as it does for buying a house.
Right, it should scale.
It should scale. And research started to come out, including some really rigorous studies from economists at Caltech,
Okay.
that provided pretty compelling evidence that even when you put significant incentives on the line, real money, people still misbehave.
Still didn't act like the perfectly rational econ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The theoretical predictions just weren't matching what people actually did, even when they had skin in the game.
Okay, so that chips away at the incentive argument.
Yeah.
What about the second big critique? Learning.
Yes, learning.
Economists argued, in the real world, unlike these maybe one-shot lab experiments, people learn from experience.
Yeah.
We learn to drive. We get better over time. Why wouldn't we learn to make better financial decisions?
It sounds plausible, right? But the big challenge with the learning argument is, well, it assumes we live in an environment where we get repeated practice for all kinds of decisions.
And we don't.
Not for everything, no. Think about it. We make small decisions, like buying lunch or coffee, almost daily. We get lots of feedback, we learn, we adjust.
Yeah, I know which sandwich place gives me heartburn now.
Exactly, you learned.
Yeah.
But for the really big life-altering decisions, buying a home, getting a mortgage, setting up your retirement savings.
You only do those a few times in your life, if that.
Precisely. You get very little practice, very little feedback over a lifetime, which means, maybe paradoxically, decision-making quality is actually more likely to go down as the stakes go up.
Because the learning isn't there.
Exactly, because the kind of learning that requires repeated practice and feedback just isn't available for those major life choices. You're basically a rookie every time.
That's a really crucial point. Okay, this leads us very naturally to mental accounting.
Yes. A fascinating area.
This idea that we treat different pots of money differently, even though, logically, money is money. It's fungible.
It is, by definition, fungible. But our minds don't seem to treat it that way. We create these these mental boxes.
Like, think about how we categorize good deals versus ripoffs.
Oh, definitely. We tend to conveniently forget how much we might have overpaid for a bad experience, like a really overpriced ski trip, maybe.
We sweep it under the mental rug.
Pretty much. But those good deals, they can be really seductive, luring us into buying things we don't actually need or value much.
Leading to closets full of bargains.
Closets full of must-buys that just sit there, rarely used. Because the deal itself felt good, regardless of the item's actual utility to us. We create these internal ledgers that don't always make objective sense.
And this has huge implications for businesses, right?
Yeah.
Especially retailers. You mentioned Macy's and JCPenney.
Yeah, that's a great example. Both of them, at different times, tried to shift away from the constant cycle of sales and coupons. They moved towards everyday low pricing.
Sounds more straightforward, less hassle.
Logically, yes. But what happened?
Sales tanked.
Sales plummeted. Customers, it turned out, actually preferred the feeling, the sort of fun, of getting a great deal, using a coupon, even if the net saving was small or non-existent compared to the everyday low price.
They liked the game.
They liked the game. They liked the feeling of winning, of getting that discount. So both companies pretty quickly reverted back to frequent sales and promotions. It just resonated better with how consumers do their mental accounting.
And the car rebate example.
Oh, yeah. A $300 rebate on a car is often perceived as much more significant, more motivating than an equivalent $300 reduction in the sticker price.
Even though it's the same amount of money.
Same amount of money. In fact, the rebate might even cost you slightly more because you pay sales tax on the pre-rebate price. But that separate check, that $300 you get back, it feels more substantial. It's in a different mental account. It's about how the gain is framed.
It's not just shopping, though. Mental accounting messes with budgeting, too, right? In organizations, even.
Oh, absolutely. You see these almost silly outcomes sometimes where, money is sitting idle in one designated budget pot.
Like the office supplies budget.
Right. While there's an urgent critical need in another area, maybe emergency repairs, that can't be met because that specific budget is empty.
Even though the organization overall has the funds.
Exactly. The labels we put on money, even if they're what economists might call supposedly irrelevant factors, or SIFs.
Yes, okay.
These labels prevent us from allocating the money in the way that best serves the overall goals or interests.
There was a study about gas prices.
Yes, a really neat one by Hastings and Shapiro during the 2007 financial crisis. Gas prices dropped significantly.
Okay, so people had more money in their pockets.
You'd think they'd spend it across the board or save it. But what happened was surprising. Families started splurging on higher grades of gasoline, premium gas.
But they didn't upgrade other things, like better milk or orange juice.
Nope. They didn't generally upgrade their milk or orange juice, even though they had this extra money from lower gas prices. They mentally treated that saving as gas money.
So it had to be spent to the pump.
It seems so. It stayed within that mental gas account. A really clear illustration of mental accounting in action affecting everyday spending.
And even something really fundamental like home equity. That used to have a different mental account, didn't it?
It absolutely did. For a long time, home equity was widely considered almost sacrosanct. It was viewed much like retirement savings, something you just didn't touch except in dire emergencies, or maybe to fund education.
So what changed?
Well, a specific policy change in the Reagan era had a big, perhaps unintended consequence. A tax reform made it so that only home mortgage interest was tax deductible, not other consumer loan interest.
Okay,
So banks saw an opportunity and started heavily marketing home equity lines of credit, or ALOCs, because the interest on those loans was deductible if tied to the house.
So it became financially rational, tax-wise, to borrow against your house for other things.
Exactly, for things like cars, vacations, renovations. And while it might have been economically rational on paper for certain purchases, this shift eroded the strong social norm that home equity was untouchable.
It moved it into a different mental account.
It effectively moved it into a more accessible, spendable mental account for many people, treating it more like another source of potential disposable income rather than long-term savings.
Right. Let's shift gears slightly and talk about self-control, or the lack thereof.
A universal human struggle.
Right. It's a problem economists haven't always liked to acknowledge formally, but it's obviously huge in real life.
Well, interestingly, even Adam Smith, often seen as the high priest of free markets, even he recognized this internal conflict. He talked about the battle between our passions and our impartial spectator, our desires versus our rational, long-term view.
So the idea isn't brand new.
Not at all. And then, much later, you have Paul Samuelson, a Nobel laureate, who developed the elegant mathematical concept of discounting future consumption.
Discounting, meaning we value things less if they're further away.
Exactly. The basic idea that we prefer, say, a great dinner this week over the exact same great dinner a year from now, we discount the future value.
Seems reasonable.
It's elegant mathematically. But Samuelson himself was cautious. He noted its serious limitations in describing actual human behavior.
Why? What's a limitation?
The big one is that people don't seem to discount the future at a constant rate the way the simple model assumes. Our discount rates actually vary depending on how far away something is.
Which leads to?
Which leads to time-inconsistent behavior. Our preferences can actually change as the future gets closer.
Okay, give me an example of this time inconsistency.
All right, imagine you're choosing between tickets for a tennis tournament. You can get tickets for the quarterfinals, the semifinals, or the grand final.
Okay, I want the final.
Right now, thinking about it far in advance, you probably strongly prefer the final. It's the most exciting match.
Definitely.
But imagine the choice is presented differently. The final is next month. The semifinal is next week. The quarterfinal is tomorrow.
Tomorrow is tempting, even if it's not the final.
Exactly. As the time gets closer, your preference might shift towards the nearer, even if objectively less desirable option. That immediate gratification becomes much more powerful.
That's time inconsistency in action.
It is. It's like that famous New Yorker magazine cover showing the view from 9th Avenue.
I think I know one.
Yeah, where the immediate blocks look huge, California is a small strip on the horizon, and China and Japan look basically the same distance away.
Our perspective is warped by proximity.
Our mental telescope for viewing the future can be faulty. Things far away get compressed, and things close up loom large. It makes consistent long-term planning difficult.
So how do we deal with this? Odysseus had a plan.
Odysseus and the Sirens, a classic example of recognizing your future weakness and taking preventative action.
What did he do again?
He knew he wouldn't be able to resist the Sirens' fatally alluring song, so he had his crew put wax in their ears so they couldn't hear it.
Removing the temptation, the cue.
Right. And then he had them tie him firmly to the mast of the ship so he could hear the song, but couldn't act on the impulse to steer towards the rocks.
A commitment strategy.
A perfect commitment strategy. He constrained his future self's actions because he knew his doer self would overrule his planner self in the moment.
So this raises a crucial theoretical question for economists, doesn't it?
It does.
If you know you're likely to change your mind later, like you plan to eat just a few cashews before dinner, but you suspect you'll actually eat the whole bowl once it's in front of you.
A common scenario.
When and why would you take action now to restrict your future choices?
Yeah.
Like putting the cashew bowl away before you start.
That became the central question. And the work I did on this with Hershefrin tried to model this internal conflict.
Using the planner and doer idea.
Yeah, we developed this framework of an internal planner representing your rational long-term interests and a doer representing your present moment desires and impulses.
A sort of internal tug of war.
Exactly. It was a metaphor, really, but it proved incredibly useful as a way to bridge the gap between the abstract math of economic models and the psychological reality of self-control struggles.
Was that easily accepted?
Oh, not initially. These ideas were considered pretty radical in mainstream economics at the time, but they offered a way to formally incorporate these well-documented psychological phenomena into economic thinking.
Okay, let's move into the heart of traditional economics. Financial markets.
Right. The efficient market hypothesis territory.
Yeah, the EMH. Which basically says the price is right. Assets sell for their true intrinsic value because all information is already baked into the price.
That's the core idea. And the implication is you can't consistently beat the market through skill or analysis, only through luck or maybe inside information.
But our price is always right. The real world seems to throw up some counterexamples.
It certainly does. There have been numerous instances that are really hard to reconcile with a strict view of the EMH. A classic one is the case of 3Com and Palm back in the year 2000 during the dot-com boom.
What happened there?
So 3Com was the parent company, and it owned almost all of Palm, which made popular handheld devices. 3Com decided to spin off a small percentage, about 5% of Palm shares to the public.
Okay, an IPO for a part of Palm.
Right. But what happened next was bizarre. The market went crazy for Palm. The price shot up so high that the market value of just the 5% of Palm shares that were publicly traded became greater than the market value of the entire 3Com company.
Wait, but 3Com still owned the other 95% of Palm?
Exactly. 3Com still owned 95% of this incredibly valuable subsidiary, plus all its other businesses. Yet, the market was valuing the parent company at less than just its stake in Palm. It was like saying a slice of pizza is worth more than the whole pie.
That makes no sense from an efficient market perspective.
None at all. It was a clear, undeniable mispricing. The value implied for 3Com's other businesses was hugely negative.
So what does a situation like that, or the broader dot-com bubble, or the housing crash later, what does that imply about market efficiency?
Well, an efficient market advocate might try to explain it away, maybe arguing the parent company was mismanaging things terribly. But the scale of these mispricing,
Factor of 2 or 3 you mentioned.
sometimes, yeah, it really suggests that prices can deviate significantly and persistently from fundamental value. Look at the NASDAQ Q index. It lost over 2/3 of its value between 2000 and 2002. That's not just a minor correction.
These are what behavioral finance calls anomalies, right? Things that EMH struggles with.
Precisely. Anomalies are patterns or events that contradict the theory. And for years, things like value investing strategies, buying stocks that look cheap based on fundamentals, like Benjamin Graham taught.
Warren Buffett's mentor.
Right. Those strategies were shown to work to generate excess returns pretty consistently. But efficient market theorists had a hard time explaining why they worked if the market was truly efficient.
Did researchers finding these effects face pushback?
Oh, absolutely. Researchers like Sanjoy Basu, who found evidence for the value effect, or Rolf Bands, who found that small-cap stocks tended to outperform large-cap stocks.
The size effect.
Yes, they often felt compelled to offer almost abject apologies in their published papers.
Apologies for finding something real.
Sort of. The underlying assumption was so strong that the market must be efficient, that if their findings contradicted it, the problem must be with their model, maybe missing risk factors rather than with the market itself. The burden of proof was incredibly high.
Okay, let's connect this to individual behavior. Myopic loss aversion. What's that about?
Myopic loss aversion combines two key behavioral ideas. Loss aversion, the fact that losses hurt psychologically about twice as much as equivalent gains feel good.
We hate losing more than we like winning.
Exactly. And myopia, meaning short-sightedness or evaluating outcomes too frequently.
Okay, so how does it play out? You mentioned a colleague and bets.
Right. Imagine offering a colleague a single bet, say a 50-50 chance to win $150 or lose $100.
The potential loss looms large.
Many people, due to loss aversion, would turn that down even though the expected value is positive. $25, it feels too risky.
Okay.
But now offer the same colleague a series of 100 identical bets. Win $150, lose $100, 50-50 chance, repeated 100 times.
Now it seems much more attractive.
Yeah.
The odds are overwhelmingly in your favor over 100 trials.
Precisely. Most people would readily accept the series of 100 bets. The chance of actually losing money overall becomes minuscule, and the expected gain is substantial, $2,500.
So what's a mistake?
The behavioral mistake, if you want to call it that, is turning down the single bet. The reason people accept the series but reject the single bet often comes down to narrow framing.
Thinking about each bet in isolation.
Yes, thinking about each one individually where the pain of a potential loss dominates. When you frame it broadly as 100 bets together, the overall statistical picture becomes much clearer and more appealing.
And this applies to investing.
Absolutely. How often investors check their portfolio performance, say, monthly versus annually, can significantly influence their willingness to take on risk.
Checking more often makes you more risk-averse.
It tends to, because if you check frequently, you're more likely to see short-term losses, which trigger that loss aversion. If you only look annually, you're more likely to see the long-term positive trend, making you more comfortable holding riskier assets like stocks. Your evaluation frequency, your myopia, affects your decisions.
Let's switch arenas again to professional sports, NFL draft picks. The hypothesis you mentioned was that early picks are overvalued.
Yes, this is based on research looking at the actual performance of players relative to where they were drafted and what teams traded to get those picks.
And what did they find?
Consistently, teams seem to overpay for the very top picks. For example, the #1 overall pick is often valued in trades at about 5 times the value of the first pick in the second round, pick 33.
Okay, 5 times the value. But do they perform 5 times better?
Not even close. The data suggests a first-round pick only has about a 56% chance of being rated much better than a player taken significantly later. The drop-off in actual value is much less steep than the drop-off in trade value or draft position.
So teams are consistently overpaying for those top spots. Why? Overconfidence.
Overconfidence is likely a big part of it. Teams fall in love with a prospect, overestimate their ability to predict success, and pay a premium based on hope rather than purely objective probabilities. It happens even in this incredibly high-stakes, data-rich environment.
It suggests maybe conventional wisdom isn't always optimal.
Exactly. And it might hint at why many NFL owners or executives in general might be hesitant to hire people who are really deep into probabilities and analytics, the 10% club, as they're sometimes called.
Why wouldn't they want the smartest people?
Because if you follow the conventional wisdom, even if it's slightly suboptimal and things go wrong, you're less likely to get fired. Everyone thought player X was the best pick. But if you make a contrarian, data-driven pick and it fails,
You stick your neck out, you might lose your head.
precisely, there's a safety in conforming, even if it leads to predictably biased decisions like overvaluing top picks.
This reminds me a bit of the findings with the cab drivers you mentioned earlier.
Yes, the cab driver study. That also touches on experience and framing.
What was the difference between experienced and inexperienced drivers?
More experienced drivers tended to behave more like the rational econs. They drove more hours on days when the effective wage rate was higher, like rainy days or during big events, and knocked off earlier on slow days.
Maximizing their earnings potential.
Right. But the inexperienced drivers often seem to have a fixed daily income target in mind.
Like, I need to make $200 today.
Exactly. And once they hit that target, say $200, they'd just go home. Even if it was a really busy, high-wage day where they could have easily made $300 or $400 by working a bit longer.
So they were leaving money on the table.
They were because of that narrow framing. They were focused only on the daily target, that specific mental account, rather than thinking about maximizing their income over the week or the month. Experience seemed to help overcome that narrow focus.
Okay, so we've seen misbehavior in labs, in financial markets, in the NFL, with cab drivers. But how do we get from observing these things to actually applying the insights?
That's the crucial step, moving from diagnosis to application. And one challenge, as you noted, is that in complex settings like markets or drafts, while you see the outcome that looks like misbehavior, it's sometimes hard to pin down the exact behavioral cause. Was it overconfidence, loss aversion, herd behavior?
Hard to isolate the mechanism.
Exactly, and that's where certain settings became really valuable for researchers, like, surprisingly, game shows.
Game shows, like Deal or No Deal.
Precisely like Deal or No Deal, that show, and others like it, offered a kind of natural laboratory.
How so?
Well, you have real people making decisions with significant real financial stakes, often thousands or even millions of dollars.
Okay, heist.
And it's happening in a relatively controlled environment where you know the probabilities, you know the offers, you can observe their choices directly. It moved beyond asking people hypothetical questions about risk.
You could see how loss aversion or reference points actually played out under pressure.
Exactly. It provided cleaner data on individual decision-making under risk when the stakes were genuinely high.
Okay, so the evidence builds up from labs, from the real world, from game shows.
Yeah.
How does this then translate into changing things, into policy? The book Nudge was obviously huge here.
It really was. Nudge, which I co-authored with Cass Sunstein, was written with, honestly, a somewhat faint hope that it might influence policy discussions.
And it did more than that.
It absolutely did, far beyond our initial expectations. One very direct consequence was the creation of the Behavioral Insights Team, or BIT, in the UK government.
The Nudge Unit.
That's the nickname, yeah. Its explicit mission was to take insights from behavioral science and apply them to make government services more effective and efficient, often through low-cost interventions.
So small changes with potentially big impacts.
That was the goal. They started running these experiments, randomized controlled trials, which were often incredibly cheap to implement, but had the potential for huge payoffs.
What was one of the big early wins?
Tax collection was a major one. They worked with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the UK Tax Authority.
Okay, getting people to pay taxes on time. Always a challenge.
Always. So they experimented with simply changing the wording in the reminder letters sent to people who were late paying.
What did they add?
In one successful version, they simply added a sentence that said something like, "Most people in your area pay their taxes on time. You are currently in the very small minority of people who have not paid us yet."
Ah, the social norm nudge. Peer pressure, basically.
Exactly. Leveraging the fact that most people want to conform, to do what others are doing, and the results were remarkable.
How much difference did it make?
That simple sentence increased payment rates by over 5 percentage points almost immediately, which, scaled up, meant they collected an extra £9 million in overdue revenue for the government in just the first 23 days of the trial.
Oh, for the cost of changing a sentence.
Highly, highly cost-effective. It showed the real power of these subtle, behaviorally informed nudges.
Organ donation is another powerful example, isn't it? The difference between opt-in and opt-out systems.
A stark example, yes. Many countries like the US and Germany for a long time use an opt-in system. You have to actively take a step, check a box, sign a form to become an organ donor.
So the default is not being a donor.
Right. But other countries like Spain, Austria, Belgium use an opt-out system, often called presumed consent.
Meaning everyone is assumed to be a donor unless they actively say no.
Exactly. The default is switched, and the difference in donation rates is just dramatic.
How dramatic.
In many opt-out countries, effective consent rates are upwards of 90%, sometimes close to 99%. In typical opt-in countries, it's often down in the 10–20% range, maybe lower.
Just by changing the default.
Primarily, yes. It shows how incredibly powerful defaults are. That inertia, the tendency to stick with the pre-selected option, has massive impacts on socially desirable outcomes like organ donation without actually forcing anyone to do anything.
And we see similar effects in retirement savings.
Absolutely. The shift towards automatic enrollment in workplace retirement plans like 401ks in the U.S. has been one of the biggest successes of applied behavioral economics.
So instead of having to actively sign up, you're automatically put in unless you actively opt out.
Correct. And studies comparing different factors contributing to increased savings found that automatic enrollment features accounted for something like 99% of the increase in participation and savings rates.
99%. What about things like tax breaks for saving?
Tax breaks, incredibly, were estimated to account for only about 1% of the increase.
That's stunning. The simple default setting is vastly more powerful than the direct financial incentive.
It really highlights the power of inertia and defaults over standard economic incentives in this context.
And these nudges don't have to be about big policy issues like taxes or savings, right? They can be simpler.
Oh, definitely. Think about simple text message reminders. There's a program called READY4K.
Oh.
It sends simple, actionable parenting tips via text message 3 times a week to parents of preschoolers focused on literacy and development.
Just little nudges for parents.
Just little nudges.
Yeah.
And randomized trials found that this incredibly low-cost program significantly increased parental involvement in literacy activities at home and led to measurable learning gains for the children.
So nudges can be truly gentle, just helpful reminders or tips.
Exactly. They don't have to be about overcoming major self-control problems. They can just make it easier to do things we already want to do or provide timely information. Highly effective and very low friction.
Okay, thinking about all this, how does this behavioral perspective change the way policymakers should think about big economic interventions? Like, say, a tax cut designed to stimulate the economy.
It suggests that the details of how that policy is implemented, details that traditional economics might dismiss as irrelevant, are actually crucial.
Like what kind of details?
Well, for example, whether the tax cut is delivered as a one-time lump sum payment, or if it's spread out over time, maybe by slightly reducing withholding from each paycheck.
Traditional theory would say it shouldn't matter, right? Money is money.
Traditional theory, assuming rational econs, would say your total wealth increases by the same amount either way, so your spending behavior should be the same.
But behavioral insights suggest
Behavioral insights, particularly around mental accounting and self-control, strongly suggest it does matter. A lump sum payment is more likely to be seen as a windfall, maybe used to pay down debt or put into savings, a different mental account,
whereas smaller amounts mixed in with regular income
are more likely to be treated like regular income and simply spent. So if the goal of the tax cut is specifically to stimulate spending,
then spreading it out is probably better.
the evidence strongly suggests spreading it out is more effective. That's a critical behavioral detail that a purely traditional analysis would likely miss, but it could make the difference between the policy achieving its goal or not.
It really sounds like behavioral economics is fundamentally transforming how we understand human decisions, from the individual choices all the way up to macro-level policy.
I think it is. It's about grounding economic theory more firmly in empirically observed facts about how humans actually behave, rather than relying solely on abstract models built around idealized econs.
It's bringing psychology and economics back together.
In many ways, yes. And you see it reflected in methodology, too. The growing popularity and acceptance of randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, within economics.
Like the ones the nudge unit used.
Exactly. It shows how the field is embracing experimentation and looking beyond just monetary incentives as the only tool in the toolkit. It's a recognition that treating all money as the same, or assuming money is the sole driver of motivation, just doesn't align with reality.
So we've taken a really deep dive today into how humans, us, actually make decisions.
We certainly have.
And it's clear we're pretty far from the perfectly rational econs of traditional economic theory.
Far, far away sometimes.
From getting that weird kick out of a 137-point exam.
Right.
To our, sometimes, let's face it, irrational attachment to things like free sports tickets or how we mentally fence off different kinds of money.
And even how governments can use these subtle nudges to help us pay taxes on time or save more for the future.
Behavioral economics just offers such powerful and often counterintuitive insights.
I think the really profound implication here is how these seemingly small quirks, these misbehaviors, they don't just cancel out. They can add up. They can have really significant impacts on how markets function, on our individual well-being, and even on the success or failure of national policies.
It's a shift from abstract models to messy but real human behavior.
Exactly. Grounding the theory in how people actually are, not just how we might assume them to be in a simplified model.
So wrapping this up for you, our listener, what does this all mean for you?
Well, maybe next time you're making a decision, especially a bigger one.
Buying a car, thinking about investments, maybe even just deciding whether to eat that whole bowl of cashews.
Right. Pause for a second and just consider. Are you operating purely like a rational econ right now? Or is your inner human, with all its biases and shortcuts, playing a big role?
Are there hidden mental accounts influencing how you're valuing different options? Is there a default setting subtly nudging you one way or another without you even realizing it?
It raises a really interesting question, doesn't it? In a world that's often designed for econs, assuming perfect rationality, how can you, knowing about these predictable biases and heuristics, leverage these insights, maybe to make more informed choices for yourself, understanding your own likely pitfalls?
Or even, if you're in a position to influence things, how could you design better systems, better choices, architectures for others, knowing how humans actually decide?
That's the ongoing challenge and opportunity, I think.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into our often irrational but fascinatingly human decision-making processes.
It's been a pleasure.
We really hope you found these insights as engaging and maybe even as useful as we did.